You're listening to On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. The APEC Multi-Stakeholder Forum lasted 4 days, and the conversations ranged from climate policy to workforce retraining and retooling to artificial intelligence. And they featured indigenous leaders from as close as Nevada to as far away as New Zealand. One of the most respected voices in the room was that of Maui Solomon, a well-known indigenous rights activist, mediator, and negotiator in New Zealand.
I'm here as one of the delegation from Aotearoa, New Zealand, here with all my Māori colleagues. We're really honoured to be here, and thank you very much. Looking forward to participating over the next couple of days.
That morning, he spoke on a panel about how the stories of indigenous communities across the Pacific are interconnected, and how they all deserve representation and inclusion when we talk about a just transition. Raylene Whitford was also on that panel. She's director of the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board. And after their lively discussion on stage, I caught up with them. Here's part of our conversation. Tell me about the role of indigenous communities at this APEC conference. Raylene, let me start with you.
Great. Well, thank you for having us here today to speak with you. So the APEC Multi-Stakeholder Forum is the first forum that has included diverse perspectives and voices from around the APEC member economies. We have quite a large Indigenous delegation here from Aotearoa, New Zealand, the US, Canada, and several other countries. And so we're here to begin to have a dialogue with the other stakeholders in the room as to the importance of Indigenous voices and inclusion in the energy transition. As Indigenous people, we live an inherently sustainable lifestyle, and we have inherent ties to the land, to Okinawa, which in Cree we call Mother Earth. So it's critical that we're involved in this dialogue. And to me, this is just the beginning.
Maui Solomon, how do you make sure it's not just a feel-good moment, a bit of PR magic? How do you make sure that this is not an APEC, as it so often is, that goes on at 35,000 feet, way above the heads of most people on planet Earth?
Oh, kia ora, Ray. I think that's an excellent question. And in a previous life, I was a barrister, and I used to attend a lot of international conferences as an advocate for Indigenous people. And I sort of got tired of that because our voices weren't being listened to. So I went back home and concentrated my time and energy back home over the last 10 or 15 years. But I've been encouraged to get back involved in the international arena in APEC and also WTO, where I first met Raylene back in Geneva in September. But your question is, how do we ensure that those who hold the reins of power are going to listen to our voice? And this has been an issue for Indigenous peoples for many, many centuries. But I think with the APEC Multi-Stakeholder Forum, it's a step in the right direction. It's the first time this has happened. This is a first step towards having a voice within APEC itself. Because from an Indigenous perspective, what we're saying is not just relevant and important to our own cultures and identity, but it's actually important to helping to heal the planet and to deal with this climate crisis we're facing, because Indigenous people have thousands of years of accumulated wisdom and knowledge that we're prepared to share with the world as to how we can deal with the crisis we're facing. But those who hold the reins of power need to open their ears to listen and to hear and then to take action. We're one of many voices, but I think someone said yesterday, and I totally agree, that Indigenous and traditional peoples preserve and manage 80% of the Earth's surviving biodiversity. So our voice really needs to be heard, because there's a reason why we are the stewards of 80% of the world's biodiversity.
Well, that's a good point, because looking around the member states of APEC, there are Indigenous people dug in their ancestral lands who are often seen in their capitals as standing in the way of development, standing in the way of progress. Just some quick examples come to mind. In Peru, Indigenous people worked for years to stop cross-Andean development to help extract the wealth from the Amazon basin and said, you can't do this, and if you're going to do it, you can't do it the way you want to do it. In Canada, Raylene Whitford, there have been many times, and certainly in the Western United States as well, when Indigenous people who were often taken off their ancestral lands parked somewhere else, and when they found out the somewhere else where they were parked was now very valuable, they tried to move them again, and they just said, no. Are we at a point where we can't go back to those old ways of handling Indigenous people? Are their rights recognized in a way that makes that backsliding impossible?
So I think that's a really complex question. And I think what I'll offer as a response is that, one, I want to recognize that all Indigenous people, we're not a monolith. We have a massively diverse set of cultures, governance systems, spirituality, languages. So, it's one thing to advocate for the recognition of Indigenous rights and inclusion, but we are not the same. And in Canada, Latin America, Asia Pacific, the one of the things that we have in common is the oppression and the colonization and the process of being removed and kept away from any of the decisions that are made about us. So it's been a very patriarchal approach in Canada. And I would say that we're only at the beginning of recognizing and upholding Indigenous rights in my country.
I'd just like to have the chance to also respond to that question, because it's not about going back to the past. And this is the issue. A lot of the developed nations and modern society think Indigenous people want to go back, turn the clock back 1,000 years. It's not about that at all. It's about taking those lessons and those values and that wisdom that's accumulated over thousands of years and applying it at a modern day context. We talk about traditional knowledge. Traditional knowledge continues to evolve. We have modern day traditional knowledge based on our ancestral values, how to care for the earth, how to care for the sea, how to care for the sky. These are the things that I think need to be factored into how we're managing our planet. And if you look how we've managed it just in the last 200 years, is the reason why we're now facing this crisis, this climate crisis. And yet Indigenous peoples, we've traded might and law forever, for thousands of years. But when Indigenous people come to the table to talk economics and trade and commerce, it's about putting people and the planet above profit. Because if profit is the sole motivator, which it has been for the last 100 or so years in our capitalist and materialist and consumer society, then we're failing. And we're failing as a planet. We're failing as a species. And I think this is where Indigenous people have a really important contribution to make.
Is APEC really the place to have that conversation? A place that almost exists to talk about profit?
We have to have that conversation in as many places as possible around this world. I think that the world is in transition. We are polarized at the moment, and there is a real urgency to solve the climate crisis. And so by having delegations at APEC, WTO, COP, these global forums, it's really important to reiterate a collective message of the importance of inclusion.
What form has that taken in your home country, Maui, when you say that there's all this accumulated wisdom, understanding about how to live on the earth in a way that's protective rather than exploitive? Are there decisions that have been made in your capital that reflect a new sensibility where your people have had input into how things have gone down?
Yeah, no, good question, Ray. So the Māori chiefs and tribes in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we signed a treaty in 1840 with Queen Victoria, which guaranteed full, exclusive and undisturbed possession of our lands, forests, fisheries and all other treasured possessions. That treaty wasn't really honoured, but we've fought back over the last 40 or 50 years to secure a kind of a beachhead of resources and to ensure that our voice is once again heard within our own nation. And so we've seen the legal landscape changing over the last 20 years so that our values and our voice is now being reflected in regulation and legislation. I'll give you one example. The tribe from the Whanganui River They've had the Whanganui River, which is, they say in their whakatauki or their proverb, they are the river and the river is them. So we now have legislation that recognises the river as a legal entity with its own life force. And there's other things happening within our country that's reflecting and acknowledging Indigenous, Māori and Moriori values. And they're things that really aren't just of benefit to Māori, but of benefit to the nation. And so we're also having treaty settlements between the different tribes and the Crown to compensate for losses that were suffered as a result of the loss of land under the Treaty of Waitangi. And Māori are now becoming strong players in the economy in New Zealand, but they're doing things quite differently. So instead of selling off a lot of our assets to foreign owners living offshore, we're not sellers of those assets, we're developers, and we get into partnerships. So there's a different perspective that we bring as ancient stewards of the land that are of benefit to our nation. And I think that would probably apply to Indigenous peoples right around the world.
Well, just off the top of my head, I mean, there's Moros in the South Philippine Islands. There are native islanders in what's now Irian Jaya, the western half of Papua New Guinea. There are Maya in Mexico, non-Han ethnic people in China, all of whom don't have as much recognition as your two people have in your respective countries. Is APEC a place where they can kind of take you to the side and say, well, what did you do? How did you get there? What's in the toolbox? How can we turn things around from our relative position, which in many APEC member countries is just not good?
I'd like to respond to that. So this morning at breakfast, I was privileged to sit with an individual from Thailand whose parents are stateless. They are not recognized as Indigenous people or citizens in the country that he is from. It is an APEC member economy. There are so many different populations of Indigenous people around the world who do not enjoy the same recognition of rights as we do in Canada and some of the other, I guess, countries, Commonwealth countries. I see it as our responsibility to hold open the door for them. I see it as our responsibility to support them. I see it as our responsibility to celebrate them. It's through that collective strength, that admiration, that I think we can begin to have more resilience and strength to begin to encourage our governments and our structures that we have to operate in to recognize our First Peoples and to provide them with avenues to have rights and to participate at the same level as the regular citizens of each economy.
I'd just like to totally endorse what Raylene has said and just add that there's this recent partnership council that's been established when Aotearoa New Zealand hosted APEC in 2021, and it's called the Indigenous Peoples Economic Trade and Cooperation Arrangement, and it's open to all APEC countries and indeed all WTO countries and Indigenous peoples to be part of that partnership council. So it's a partnership between nation states and First Nations Indigenous peoples. The 4 founding members are from Aotearoa New Zealand, Canada, Australia and Taiwan or Chinese Taipei. But there's also a provision in IPECTA, which is the acronym for what I've just said, to obtain observer status. So I would invite, and I said to our brother from Thailand that his community could apply to be an observer on IPECTA and actually have a voice and have a presence within that body so that their voices are being heard, even if they're not recognised back at home. It's a collective effort, and we need to keep the space open and create ethical spaces for other groups who aren't as unfortunate as we are, and actually back home would say, well, actually we're not that fortunate, but it's all relative, isn't it? So we need to keep creating those opportunities and those spaces for our Indigenous brothers and sisters and tribal peoples to participate.
One of the themes of this year's conference is making a just transition to a new energy economy. I understand that you both have problems even with the phrase, so why don't we pick that apart and talk about justice and transition? Raylene?
Well, what I said in the panel this morning, so in my home province, we are not even allowed to say the term just transition. That is a bad word because I come from a very petrocentric, oil-producing province in Canada. I think the term just, that means different things to different people. I think that to me, it means being inclusive as you can of the unheard. I don't like the term underserved because I think that's imbued with a power differential, and that is not going to help us get through the challenge that we have in front of us today. But I think it is involving the unheard and these different perspectives, these different knowledge holders, these different rights holders to participate in the change that we all have to make. If we don't, we will continue to have projects delayed, permits revoked, and just in this terrible conflict that we've faced, well, in Canada and the US, for example, to date. So we have to be inclusive, we have to listen, and we have to be open to a diversity of perspectives.
Well, right at the beginning of your answer, you noted that you come from a part of Canada that's involved in energy extraction. In fact, in Alberta, the tar sands are both a treasure trove of British thermal units, BTUs, and also some of the dirtiest energy possible to use on the planet. So when we think about the Alberta tar sands and we think about just transition, what do you want? What would you tell Justin Trudeau? What would you tell your fellow Albertans? Leave it in the sand? Don't extract it? Don't have it floating in kerosene through enormous pipelines through the United States and out to the Gulf of Mexico? What's the answer in the context of a just transition? Do we get that dirty oil, no matter how dirty it is, because it's there? Or do we try to find a way to leave it there?
It's a good question. I think if I had the answer to that question, I wouldn't be here. There's no simple solution. So, for example, in my province, we have a plethora of communities who are dependent on oil production, gas production, transport, etc. So the way our industry has developed has tied us to the economic prosperity that these projects can bring. I do think, though, that we need to be thinking forward. We can't continue to do what we're doing because it is destroying the environment, and the world is moving on. So what I would encourage my relatives, our communities, our Indigenous people, and the Canadian public is to find a meaningful path forward that involves the input of everybody and prioritizes Indigenous rights holders. There are several communities in my home province and across Canada who strongly support oil production. Now, should we make that decision for them and say that that should not happen? Well, that doesn't allow them to be self-determining nations, which the United Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples provides us. So I think being open to having that conversation and bringing a diversity of perspectives is key. I also think that it'll be a reiterative process. So we can't come up with one report that has a very clear linear pathway to net zero. But I think working better together with stronger relationships will give us a better possibility of arriving at that.
Maui Solomon, when you hear that phrase, just transition, what does it mean to you? And do you have any hesitancy about using it?
Before coming here, I hadn't heard of that term and I had to Google it. But I also, as a lawyer in a previous life, I thought about the word just, and it's a relative term really, isn't it? Who's determining what's just? Because if you're a multinational oil-producing company, you might say it's just to continue producing fossil fuels to help the economy. But if you're a tribe, or if you're, say, people in the Pacific Island nations who are suffering from rising sea levels and acidification of the ocean, because of the accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere, you're going to say, oh, no, that's not just. So it's a relative term. And so with anything, you need to actually understand what are we talking about. The way that it's been discussed in the AMF conference here over the last couple of days is to ensure that disadvantaged and vulnerable communities and transitioning away from fossil fuels to a net zero carbon and to alternative uses of energy aren't unfairly prejudiced or left out. And if I look at my own small island community of Rekuhu Chatham Islands, which is an island based 800 kilometres off the east coast of New Zealand, we're addicted to diesel because we've got this relatively small population, 600 people, but our mains power is supplied by diesel generators. Our fishing fleet is fueled by diesel. Farm machinery is fueled by diesel. The third aspect of our economy is from visitors, from tourists, and they get here from flying over from New Zealand and Australia. So if suddenly we were to go to an alternative or to be weaned off diesel, it's not going to happen overnight. It has to be transitioned or happen over time. There needs to be a clear plan. But one of the things I also said is that we need to look at what resources we do have. There's the sun, there's solar energy, there's wind. We've got a lot of wind on the Chatham Islands. In fact, my father once told me it blows so hard on the Chathams it blows everything off the land except the mortgage. And it's quite true. So we can utilise the sea as it's got 2 tidal movements within 24 hours. So we could be looking at generating power from the sea. It's a huge resource to APEC nations. It's looking at what are the alternative sources of energy and transitioning over time towards a more sustainable net zero carbon societies. But that's going to take time. And, when you're an addict, it takes time to be weaned off those things, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, and as Raylene noted, you're both not a monolith. And in her particular case, there are tribal groups advocating for the continued exploitation of fossil fuels. So if you look across not only the APEC members, but across the world, many of the poorest communities, certainly in the APEC members, are indigenous people. They need economic growth. They need economic growth in order to become full shareholders and have that burden of poverty relieved and be able to live the life expectancy of their fellow citizens in these countries. Can you be for economic growth and what the oil companies might consider against it at the same time? How do you strike that balance, Maui?
That's a very good point. But again, if we're just going to continue on the path we're on, we don't have a future. That's the bottom line. And we're already at a minute to midnight. Some would say we're past midnight, but I tend to live in hope. So we've got wonderful technology today, and we've got wonderful natural resources. The sun is the greatest source of natural energy. We've got the seas, we've got wind, we've got these magnificent resources available, and we really need to do more to utilise them in driving our economy, our vehicles, our fishing fleets. Like my ancestors, Polynesian ancestors, settled 30 square million miles of ocean over 3,000 years in the Pacific Ocean, and they did that by sailing, by using the wind. Why can't we be looking at wind and solar to drive these big tankers around the world instead of fossil fuels? Some might say, well, that's impossible, but I think humans have demonstrated by going to the moon in the 60s, anything's possible.
What will convince you that this was a good idea? When you get on airplanes and go back home, what will have you taking off from San Francisco International Airport and thinking, all right, I'm glad I came. This was worthwhile. This was important for me to be here.
I think the connections. So we've only been here for 2 days, not even 2 days, and we've already forged so many deep, important connections with other leaders around the world. I also think the Multi-Stakeholder Forum is a place to reiterate the message of inclusion and respect for rights. So even though the forum is only 4 days long, I think the message that we discuss and kind of take home with us to our own economies, that will be just further solidified and strengthened through the connections that we've been able to form here.
And you, Maui?
Yeah, I agree with Raylene. It's whenever I come to these international fora, and I'd stopped coming for about 15 years, but I'm glad I've started again because it is a reaffirmation of what you're doing back at home, because there are lots of people dealing with the same issues, the same struggles, and trying to make a difference in their part of the world, whether it's by planting a tree, networking, helping the planet. And a collective voice is a powerful voice. And so I think it's great for Indigenous peoples to be at the AMF, but we really need to be talking to those who hold the reins of power. And I'd like to think that at some time in the not too distant future, we can be talking to the leaders of our nation states, those who really wield the power, because what we have to say, I think, is equally important for them and society as it is for our own cultures and identities.
That's Maui Solomon. He's the chairman of the Moriori Imi Settlement Trust. He joined me on Shifting Ground along with Raylene Whitford, director of the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board. Great to have you both. Good to talk to you.
Hi, Ray.
Yeah, thank you, Ray. Me rongo.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Elise Manukian and Andrew Stelzer. It was fact-checked by Adam Ailey. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yun is CEO of World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.